Adapt: Why Success Always Starts with Failure by Tim Harford. Picture yourself deciding to build something utterly simple, an everyday toaster, from absolute scratch. Not from a kit, but genuinely from nothing but dirt and rock. A young design student named Thomas Thwaites actually attempted this wild experiment. He figured, how difficult could it possibly be? After all, toasters have been around for a century, they're cheap and dependable. But the moment he disassembled one, he discovered over 400 separate components. He needed copper for the wires, iron for the steel grill, nickel for the heating element, and plastic for the outer shell. What followed was a descent into a kind of magnificent obsession. To extract iron, he traveled to an abandoned mine in Wales, now serving as a museum. He attempted to smelt the ore, using medieval technology, and failed spectacularly. He even experimented with hair dryers and leaf blowers, then 2 microwave ovens, one of which literally melted during the process, just to produce an iron lump the size of a coin. The plastic proved equally nightmarish. Without access to crude oil, he tried creating it from potato starch, only to watch his efforts get devoured by snails. Eventually, he had to bend the rules, salvaging plastic from a neighborhood dump. After months of exhausting work, traveling across the country, wrestling with ancient technologies and modern regulations, he finally pieced together his creation. It resembled less of a toaster and more of a misshapen, partially melted birthday cake. He gathered his courage, plugged it into the outlet, and 2 seconds later, it became toast. The entire contraption melted into a worthless blob. This simple, almost absurd failure reveals something profound about why our modern world functions at all, and why tackling our most significant challenges, from climate change to financial disasters, and even obstacles in our personal lives, prove so extraordinarily tough. We inhabit a world so intricate that no individual, regardless of their brilliance, can fully grasp it, much less construct a basic toaster from the ground up. In his remarkable book Adapt, economist and storyteller Tim Harford takes us on an expedition to uncover this hidden truth. Harford belongs to that rare breed of thinkers who can identify the invisible threads connecting a failed toaster, a catastrophic war, and a Nobel Prize-winning breakthrough. He challenges our instincts about problem-solving, showing us they're completely backward. We search for flawless plans, visionary leaders, and infallible experts. But success, he demonstrates, doesn't emerge from avoiding failure, it springs directly from failure itself. By the time we finish today's journey together, you'll grasp the 3 fundamental principles that determine success in any complicated system. You'll discover why the world's most successful organizations aren't the ones with the finest plans, but rather the ones most skilled at extracting lessons from their mistakes. And you'll gain a transformative new framework for confronting challenges in your own life, not by striving for perfection, but by mastering the art of failing well. This isn't merely a book summary. It's your guide to an entirely new way of thinking. We all carry an instinct, a deeply rooted conviction, that when facing a complicated problem, we need a brilliant leader, someone who can grasp the complete picture, craft a master plan, and direct everyone to execute it flawlessly. We elect presidents promising sweeping change, then feel disappointed when they can't deliver. We celebrate visionary executives, then express shock when their companies stumble. But what if this instinct is fundamentally misguided? Psychologist Philip Tetlock dedicated 20 years to investigating exactly this question. He assembled nearly 300 of the world's leading experts, political scientists, economists, intelligence analysts, and asked them to make specific, measurable predictions about future events. He posed over 27,000 questions in total. His findings were humbling. These brilliant minds, the very people advising presidents and managing global corporations, were shockingly terrible at forecasting what would happen next. The more famous the expert, the worse their predictions tended to be. This wasn't about intelligence. The problem wasn't the experts themselves. The problem was the world. It's simply too complex for anyone to completely understand, let alone predict. This echoes the lesson of Thomas Thwaites' doomed toaster. If one person can't even comprehend a simple household appliance, How can a single leader possibly understand how to eliminate poverty, wage a war, or design a perfect economy? The answer, Tim Harford contends, is that they can't. The systems that thrive aren't the ones depending on a single perfect blueprint. Instead, they depend on a process. A messy, chaotic, yet remarkably powerful process with a name: evolution. Evolution gets summarized as survival of the fittest, but it's more accurate to describe it as failure of the less fit. It operates through a simple, relentless algorithm: variation and selection. Experiment with numerous different approaches and discover what works. The failures get discarded. The successes get copied and improved upon. Repeat, endlessly. There's no master plan, no grand architect, just trial and error, operating at massive scale. This reveals the hidden secret behind the spectacular success of market economies. We celebrate brilliant entrepreneurs and legendary companies like General Electric or Exxon, viewing them as success icons. But we overlook the vast, invisible graveyard of failures that made their success possible. For every surviving giant, thousands of companies attempted and failed. At the automobile industry's birth, 2,000 firms existed in the United States alone. Roughly 1% survived. Today, 10% of American companies vanish every single year. Failure isn't an unfortunate side effect of market systems. It's the very engine propelling them forward. The distinction between a flourishing market economy and a centrally planned catastrophe isn't that markets avoid failure. It's that they harness it. They permit millions of small-scale experiments and provide a ruthless, efficient mechanism for determining which ones succeed. But what happens when a system gets designed to prevent this process? What happens when a system becomes pathologically incapable of variation and selection? To understand that, we need to travel back to the early Soviet Union and meet a man named Peter Palczynski. Palczynski was a brilliant engineer, possessing fierce integrity and almost absurd honesty. In the early 1900s, the Tsar dispatched him to study coal mines in Russia's Don Basin. What he discovered horrified him. Miners lived in terrible conditions, packed like firewood in overcrowded bunks. His report proved so politically explosive that he got exiled to Siberia. But Palczynski was a natural learner. He escaped Russia, journeyed across Europe, and absorbed every innovative idea he could find in engineering and management. He believed progress depended on constantly seeking fresh ideas, paying attention to local details, and learning from ground-level realities. He eventually returned to Russia and became an advisor to the new Soviet government, but he refused to let politics distort his engineering recommendations. This stubborn honesty would ultimately prove fatal. When Stalin launched his first 5-year plan, Palczynski was assigned to 2 massive projects, the Lenin Dam and the enormous steel mills of Magnitogorsk. These were prestige initiatives designed to be the world's largest. But Palczynski warned against them. He advocated for a more cautious, incremental approach. He noted that nobody had conducted proper geological surveys. Nobody had considered the human cost. For the Lenin Dam, he warned the reservoir would flood thousands of homes and valuable farmland. For Magnitogorsk, a city built from scratch in remote Russia, he worried about the fate of workers sent there. His warnings went ignored. Stalin wanted the world's largest hydroelectric project and the world's largest steel mills. He wanted a grand vision. The results were catastrophic, precisely as Palczynski had predicted. The Lenin Dam became an economic and engineering disaster. Magnitogorsk was constructed by forced laborers, thousands dying in the first winter. Workers were housed downwind from blast furnaces, suffocating in almost unimaginable pollution. Palczynski understood what the central planners in Moscow, with their maps and statistics, couldn't grasp. Real-world problems are messy, complicated, and possess a human dimension. His approach can be summarized in 3 simple rules, what we might call the Palczynski principles. First, seek out fresh ideas and experiment with new approaches. This embodies the principle of variation. Second, When attempting something new, do it at a scale where failure won't destroy you. This embodies the principle of survivability. And third, actively seek feedback and learn from your mistakes. This embodies the principle of selection. The Soviet system stood as a monument to violating all three principles. It couldn't tolerate diverse approaches. It launched gigantic projects where failure meant catastrophe. And most critically, it ruthlessly suppressed feedback. In 1928, the secret police came for Peter Palczynski. He was executed without trial. His crime, according to secret police documents, was publishing detailed statistics and attempting to set minimal goals. In other words, he was murdered for trying to discover what would work and for refusing to stay silent when he saw what wouldn't. The Soviet Union's economic flaw wasn't a shortage of creative people. It was a pathological inability to adapt. 60 years after Palczynski's execution, coal miners in the very same Don Basin he'd first studied went on strike, protesting the same grotesquely dangerous conditions he'd warned about. The system had still failed to learn. This resistance to adaptation isn't exclusive to dictatorships. Most large traditional organizations, from governments to corporations, struggle with identical problems. They love grand projects. They prefer uniform standards. And they're terrible at listening to bad news. This brings us to one of the most extraordinary stories of organizational adaptation in modern history, the turnaround of the American military in Iraq. By 2006, the situation in Iraq was an unmitigated disaster. The country was descending into brutal civil war. American forces were isolated in massive forward operating bases, giant, fortified compounds in the desert, complete with Baskin-Robbins ice cream and swimming pools. From these concrete cocoons, they'd conduct armored raids into cities, what one expert described as, quote, day tripping like a tourist in hell. They'd drive in, eliminate suspected insurgents, and drive out, leaving the local population at the mercy of terrorists and militias. Anyone cooperating with the Americans would be murdered the moment they departed. The strategy was a catastrophic failure. Back in Washington, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld was in complete denial. In a bizarre press conference, he declared he'd had an epiphany and would no longer use the word insurgents, instead calling them enemies of the legitimate Iraqi government. It perfectly echoed the Soviet mindset. If reality contradicts the plan, deny reality. But on the ground, something was shifting. A rebellion was starting, not against the American army, but within it. The rebellion was led by a handful of brave, unconventional colonels. One was a man named H.R. McMaster. McMaster was both a war hero and a scholar. He'd literally written the book on how failed leadership at the top had led to disaster in the Vietnam War. It was called Dereliction of Duty, and it was a scathing critique of how generals and politicians had created a system incapable of learning from its mistakes. In 2005, McMaster received command of the city of Tal Afar, an al-Qaeda stronghold in Iraq. The official strategy was to conduct sweeps from a nearby forward operating base. McMaster rejected it entirely. He did the exact opposite. He moved his soldiers into the city. He abandoned the safe, air-conditioned megabase and established 29 small outposts throughout the city. His men lived among the people, sharing their risks. They had no hot water or swimming pools. They took heavy casualties. But then, something remarkable happened. The people of Tal Afar, convinced the Americans were there to stay and protect them, began cooperating. They started turning in the terrorists. The insurgency collapsed with astonishing speed. McMaster's strategy directly violated orders from his superiors. He was told to stop thinking strategically. In other words, to shut up and follow the failing plan. When he requested reinforcements, his request never even reached higher command. He was viewed as a troublemaker and was twice passed over for promotion to general, a move that nearly ended his career. But McMaster wasn't alone. Other officers, like Colonel Sean McFarland in Ramadi, were conducting similar experiments. Good advice was circulating from the bottom up, through emailed articles and even a clever PowerPoint presentation called How to Win the War in Al-Anbar by Captain Trav. These frontline soldiers were adapting, experimenting, and learning, because for them, failure wasn't abstract. It meant their friends died. The story of how this bottom-up rebellion eventually became official strategy is a lesson in how even the most rigid hierarchy can be forced to adapt. The hero of this chapter is General David Petraeus. When Petraeus was put in charge of rewriting the Army's counterinsurgency doctrine, he didn't lock himself away and devise a master plan. He did the opposite. He sought out the dissenters. He invited the mavericks, the critics, the troublemakers, including H.R. McMaster, who emailed feedback from the front lines in Tal Afar. Petraeus created space for clashing perspectives, knowing the best ideas emerge from debate, not enforced unanimity. The new counterinsurgency manual that emerged was revolutionary. It was posted online and downloaded over 1.5 million times in the first month. It spread through the Army from the bottom up, transforming how soldiers thought and acted. By the time President Bush finally replaced Donald Rumsfeld and put General Petraeus in command in Iraq, an internal revolution had already transformed the military. The turnaround in Iraq wasn't the result of a new leader with a new, perfect plan. It was the result of a painful, decentralized process of trial and error. It was chaotic, rebellious, and violated every rule of traditional top-down organizations. It was, in short, an adaptive system in action. This process of adaptation, of experimenting with new approaches and discovering what works, is key to solving complex problems. But where do truly new ideas, the radical variations, originate in the first place? For that, we turn to another story of desperate conflict, the Battle of Britain. In 1931, the British Air Ministry issued a request for a new fighter plane. At the time, conventional wisdom held that bombers couldn't be stopped. The best defense was having your own bomber fleet for massive retaliation. But a few people in the ministry thought differently, and they put out a call for something new. The initial results disappointed. But one competing firm, a disorganized little company called Supermarine, returned with a radical new design. It was so unconventional it had to be funded outside normal channels. An enterprising civil servant named Air Commodore Henry Cave Brown Cave decided to order a prototype as a most interesting experiment. That plane was the Supermarine Spitfire. The Spitfire was an engineering miracle. It was so fast and agile that it helped Britain's tiny Royal Air Force fight off the overwhelming Nazi Luftwaffe, preventing an invasion that would have altered history's course. It's only slightly exaggerating to say the Spitfire was the plane that saved the free world. The prototype cost about the same as a nice London house. What was the return on that investment? You can't calculate it. The value of saving hundreds of thousands of lives and denying Adolf Hitler the atomic bomb is immeasurable. The Spitfire's lesson isn't that planners had brilliant strategy. They didn't. Most were wrong. The lesson is that the system possessed enough flexibility, enough room, to allow a most interesting experiment to happen anyway. New ideas often need safe havens to develop, places where they're protected from the crushing weight of conventional wisdom. Biologist Charles Darwin found these safe havens in the Galapagos Islands, where isolated populations of finches and tortoises evolved into unique new species. In the innovation world, these Galapagos Islands are often small, unconventional teams, shielded from corporate bureaucracy. Lockheed's famous Skunk Works, which designed the U-2 spy plane and the stealth bomber, is a classic example. Reginald Mitchell, the genius designer of the Spitfire, worked in exactly such an environment. His team was chaotic, fiercely independent, protected from the committees of the larger company that owned them. But here's the challenge. In our modern world, innovation is becoming harder and more expensive. The burden of knowledge is growing. It takes longer for scientists and inventors to learn enough to start making breakthroughs. They have to specialize more narrowly and work in larger teams. We can't simply wait for new ideas to emerge from student dorm rooms. like Google or Facebook did. For challenges like curing cancer or developing clean energy, we need ways to fund wildly experimental, expensive, long-shot projects. Traditional funding methods often fail. Government grants like those from the National Institutes of Health tend to be risk-averse. They're designed to produce a steady stream of solid, predictable science, not revolutionary breakthroughs. Just ask Mario Capecchi. In 1980, he applied for an NIH grant for 3 projects. 2 were safe bets. The third was wildly speculative. He wanted to figure out how to make a specific, targeted change to a single gene in a mouse's DNA. This was like trying to find and change a single sentence in a 70-volume encyclopedia at a molecular level. The NIH told him his idea was science fiction and strongly advised him to abandon it. They funded his other 2 projects. What did Capecchi do? He took their money, ignored their advice, and poured almost all of it into his risky project. It was a massive gamble. If he failed, his career could have been ruined. In 2007, Mario Capecchi was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for that very work. His technique, called gene targeting, has revolutionized medical research. When the NIH renewed his funding years earlier, they admitted, "We are glad you didn't follow our advice." The moral isn't just that we should admire stubborn geniuses. It's that we shouldn't have to rely on them. We need a system that actively encourages these kinds of risky bets. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is through prizes. The idea is ancient. In the 18th century, the British government offered a massive prize for a method to determine a ship's longitude at sea. The scientific establishment at the Royal Observatory was convinced the answer lay in astronomy. They failed for decades. The prize was eventually claimed by a village carpenter named John Harrison, who built a clock of astonishing accuracy that could keep time at sea. Prizes work because they're open to anyone, and they only pay for results. They don't try to pick winners in advance. They simply state a goal and reward whoever reaches it. After falling out of fashion for centuries, prizes are making a comeback. Netflix offered a $1 million prize to anyone who could improve its movie recommendation algorithm. The X Prize Foundation offers large prizes for achievements like private spaceflight and sequencing the human genome. And a massive $1.5 billion prize has been created to develop a vaccine for pneumococcal diseases, which kill nearly 1 million children yearly in poor countries. A prize allows for the ultimate combination, a completely open field for variation, where the boldest ideas can be tested, coupled with huge rewards for success. But this brings us to a final, critical question. The entire philosophy of ADAPT is built on the power of trial and error. But what if the cost of error is simply too high? What if failure isn't survivable? On the evening of July 6, 1988, on the Piper Alpha oil and gas rig in the North Sea, a series of small, mundane errors began cascading. A backup pump was started while being maintained. A safety permit was misplaced. Gas leaked, ignited, and exploded. The explosion disabled the control room. Firefighting pumps, designed to start automatically, didn't, because of a safety measure meant to protect divers. 2 nearby rigs, witnessing the inferno, continued pumping gas toward Piper Alpha, feeding the flames. Less than 2 hours after the first explosion, the entire rig collapsed into the sea. 167 men died. The financial system, it turns out, is a lot like a nuclear reactor or an offshore oil rig. Experts who study industrial accidents, like sociologist Charles Perrow, have a term for systems like these. They call them, quote, complex and tightly coupled. Complex means there are many interacting parts, and it's impossible to foresee all the ways things can go wrong. Tightly coupled means that when one thing fails, the consequences cascade through the system so quickly that there's no time to react or adapt. A line of dominoes is a simple example of a tightly coupled system. The global financial system is an infinitely more complex one. In these systems, Perrow argues, accidents aren't just possible, they're normal. They're an inevitable consequence of the system's design. The 2008 financial crisis was a normal accident. So was the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. In both cases, a series of small, seemingly recoverable errors, a faulty valve, a misleading financial report, a battery with no power, lined up like holes in slices of Swiss cheese, creating a path for catastrophe. The instinctive response is to add more safety systems, but, as we saw with Piper Alpha, safety systems themselves can introduce new, unexpected ways for things to go wrong. The financial innovations supposed to make the banking system safer, like credit default swaps, actually made it more complex and more tightly coupled. They acted like a safety harness that, instead of saving a falling mountaineer, pulls the rest of the team down with him. So if we can't eliminate failure, and we can't just pile on more safety systems, what's the answer? The answer is to decouple. To insert safety gates, like those used by professional domino topplers, that contain failures and prevent them from spreading. In the financial world, this means things like forcing banks to hold more capital, a thicker cushion against failure. It means creating better contingency plans for bankruptcy, so that a failing bank doesn't take the rest of the economy with it. And it might mean a more radical idea, like narrow banking, which would separate the essential utility functions of banking, like ATMs and savings accounts, from the riskier casino side. The goal isn't to create a system that never fails. That's an impossible dream. The goal is to create a system where failures are survivable, to accept that errors will happen, and to design our most critical systems not with the arrogant assumption of perfection, but with the humble wisdom that comes from expecting mistakes. This is the ultimate lesson of adaptation. Whether we're designing a financial system, fighting a war, inventing a new technology, or simply trying to live better lives, the path forward is the same. It's not a straight line, but a winding process of discovery. It's a journey defined not by the absence of failure, but by the willingness to learn from it. So what does all of this mean for you? For a young person standing at the beginning of a career, a life full of complex and uncertain choices? It might seem that lessons from military strategy or global finance are worlds away from your own decisions. But they aren't. The same principles governing these vast systems also govern our own lives. The world you're entering is more complex and fast-moving than any before it. The idea that you can map out a perfect career path, a grand 10-year plan, is a comforting illusion. The truth is, you can't. You don't have enough information about the world, and you don't even have enough information about the person you'll become in 10 years. The message of Adapt is liberating. It gives you permission to stop trying to be perfect. It gives you permission to experiment, to explore, and yes, to fail. Consider the story of Twyla Tharp, one of the most brilliant and innovative choreographers of our time. In 2002, she created a new show called Movin' Out, a ballet set to Billy Joel's music. It was an ambitious, high-profile project backed by millions of dollars. It premiered in Chicago, and it was a disaster. Critics called it stupefyingly cliched and embarrassingly naive. Tharp was a legend. She was 61 years old. It would have been easy for her to retreat into denial, to blame the critics, to insist that the world simply didn't understand her masterpiece. This is the natural human reaction. We suffer from what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the intense mental discomfort of holding two contradictory thoughts simultaneously. I am a brilliant choreographer, and my new show is a flop. To resolve this tension, we often choose to deny the evidence of our failure. But Tharp did something much harder and much braver. She accepted the failure. She made peace with her losses. And then she got to work. In just 3 months, she tore the show apart and rebuilt it from the ground up, all while the cast was performing the old, failed show every night. How did she do it? She relied on what she called her validation squad, a small group of trusted friends and colleagues who would tell her the truth. The morning after the terrible reviews came out, she had breakfast with an old collaborator. Her friend didn't console her. She simply said, "You know they're right." That honest feedback was the selection mechanism she needed. It allowed her to see her own creation with clear eyes, to distinguish what was working from what wasn't. 3 months later, Movin' Out opened on Broadway to triumphant reviews. It won 2 Tony Awards, including one for Tharp. It was a stunning transformation, a testament to the power of adapting in the face of failure. Twyla Tharp's story shows us how to apply the 3 Palczynski principles to our own lives. First, try new things. Give yourself permission to be a beginner. Take on projects and experiences where you don't know the outcome. This is variation. Second, make failure survivable. Don't bet your entire life savings on a single risky venture. Start with small steps. The out-of-town tryout from Movin' Out was a perfect example of a survivable experiment. It was public, but it wasn't Broadway. It gave Tharp the space to fail without destroying the entire project. And third, know when you've failed. This is the hardest part. It requires overcoming our own psychological defenses. It means building your own validation squad, people who care about you enough to give you honest feedback, not just praise. It means learning to separate your actions from your identity. A failed project doesn't make you a failure, it makes you a learner. The journey of life is a search across what the book calls a fitness landscape, a vast, shifting geography of peaks and valleys. The peaks are moments of success and fulfillment. The valleys are moments of failure and disappointment. We often admire people who seem to make giant, heroic leaps, landing on a high summit. But for most of us, progress comes from a combination of small, tentative steps and occasional, calculated risks. It comes from climbing, sometimes stumbling, and always learning from the terrain. Embracing this process can feel frightening. It means accepting uncertainty. It means being wrong, a lot. But it's also the only path to true growth. As you navigate the years ahead, you'll face choices and challenges you cannot possibly anticipate today. Don't be afraid to try, to fail, and to try again. Because success, the most profound and lasting kind, doesn't start with a perfect plan. It always starts with a willingness to adapt. That was a summary of Adapt by Tim Harford. We've explored the main highways of his argument today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. The real magic happens when you walk the trails yourself. It's in the quiet moments, when a particular story or a simple phrase connects with you in an unexpected way. This summary is designed to help you decide if this book is worth your time and attention. If anything we've discussed today has sparked your curiosity, if it's ignited a new idea or challenged an old assumption, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you see the world and your own place within it. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please take a moment to click that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells us we're on the right path and ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.